Welcome, Bronco Nation, to a very exciting video today. I'm so excited to have Ron Counts from the Idaho Statesman on with us today to preview Boise State spring football has just started up. So this is a great chance for you to learn about the big storylines coming into this spring practice, the position groups that Boise State's going to be having big competitions and battles within, and just overall analysis. I mean, Ron is one of the guys that gets to actually be in the stadium watching what's going on. So he has some great insight that he's going to share with us, of course, a writer for the Idaho Statesman. Actually, interesting side note here, his keys to victory that he does every week for Boise State football throughout the season is kind of what actually inspired my channel in the first place with my 3 keys to the game video. So it's great to be able to have Ron on here with us today. This is the first of a series of videos that I'm going to be doing throughout the season. Ron's going to be back on along with BJ Rains to talk about Khalil Shakir's draft prospects. Then I'm also going to be doing a position group by position group preview prior to the season with former players coming onto the channel and talking Boise State football. That list so far includes Ryan Dinwiddie, Dryzen James, Derek Schumann, and Tyler Rassa. And we're trying to get some more on there as well. So we'll have more on that in the future. But for now, this is a great video. Stick around. I'm excited to have this conversation. You guys all know me, Bronco Blameyer. I'm going to let Ron talk about himself for a little bit.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on. I've been here for almost 3 years now. I came from Virginia, moved out here in the middle of the 2019 season. And Bronco's right. I mean, spring ball is in full force. They're out there. The guys are pumped up and they're ready to go. We've seen some massive growth this year already. I mean, we met with Scott Matlock yesterday. He's put on 15 pounds of muscle in the offseason. The freshman running back, Ashton Jinky, looks physically ready to go from day one. Steph Cobbs looks like he's put on 5-10 pounds. So I think there's some excitement building for this season.
That's awesome. And for fans that want to connect with your writing, of course, Idaho Statesman is a great way to do that as well. But is there any additional Twitter or anything else like that fans can connect with you?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, you can read my stories on idahostatesman.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Ron_BroncoBeat.
Awesome. Fantastic. So talking about, before we get into looking at some of the newcomers that have come to this team this season, and then also going to be going through unit breakdowns, offense, defense, special teams, and then giving fans some perspective looking into the future of this team coming into this 2022 season. Before we get into that, what are the big kind of overall storylines that fans should be tracking coming into this spring football season?
Well, as you look at some of the position groups that are get the most attention, quarterback's always up there. Hank Bachmeier's coming into his 4th season. So the question is, where can he get better this season? We saw him play a smarter style of ball last year. He wasn't running the ball as much. He wasn't being as reckless and trying to take on tacklers as much. He threw the ball away a little bit better last year. We still saw some head-scratching throws in the second half of games, some bad interceptions, but that's going to happen in an offense. You got to remember, before last season, Hank Bachmeier had never run an RPO-driven offense. So that was a big-time learning curve for him. I think he's going to have a really good season this year. And then, of course, the question is, who's going to be that number 2 quarterback? Is it Sam Vidlac, the Oregon State transfer? Is it Taylon Green, who's maybe one of the most physically impressive players on the team? That's to be decided. You go down that offense. I mean, the second question is, how do they fix that running game? That's really been a struggle the past 2 years. George Holani has not been on the field very much because of injuries, so they've got to fix that, because we've seen that when they can't run the ball, this offense is not near as effective as it could be. And when they don't have George Holani, simply put, this is not the same team. It was clear last year that when he touches the ball, he's a different level athlete than anybody else in that backfield. Ashton Jinky, is he that same kind of guy? He looks like it on the field, but we won't know until the live bullets start flying. So they got to fix that running game. And then defensively, who's going to emerge as the star on that defensive line this year? We know Scott Matlock is going to have a great year. He had a career year last year, but who's going to be that second guy? Is it going to be Shane Irwin? Is it going to be the new JUCO transfer to Cortez Hogan Jr.? Is it going to be a sleeper a guy who I'm really excited to see is Herbert Gums? He's a 280, 290 nose tackle who spent much of his career as a 250-pound running back. I mean, he's just explosive, and his ceiling is huge. So I think those are some of the top storylines I'm going to be looking at. Obviously, we want to see how the team's going to grow in year 2 in Tim Plow's offense. It wasn't always pretty last year. It wasn't always great, but I think with another year in this system, that they're going to be much improved in that area. The RPO game comes with timing. There's a feel aspect to it, especially on the offensive line. So having a full year in that system is going to be a huge difference this year.
I think you're absolutely right. Coming from we always focus on spring football. We talk about the players. That's always the focus. It's going to be the focus in any spring football. But a bigger, maybe more important focus is the coaches. This is the first spring practice that they have been able to fully prepare for with their recruits coming in, with their guys a year under their belt, a full season under their belt. This is the first one for Boise State that they have really been able to come in and prepare for and have a full offseason there to prep for coming into it. So it's going to be interesting to see how the coaches change things up, how they run spring practice overall, to see what kind of changes they can make to an offense that was not consistent last season. We saw Tim Plow coming into the stage. We saw some brilliant plays. I mean, we really did. I can remember some really incredible, brilliant plays where they just used misdirection to fool defense and busted wide open touchdowns. And then they had, like you said, with Hank Bachmeier as well, but as well as Tim Plow, I think we also saw some head scratchers from his end as well as far as play calling. So I think part of it was Tim Plow adjusting to this level, FBS, first-time offensive coordinator at the FBS level, Division I FBS level. And then also the players, like you said, adjusting to his offense. So how are things going to move forward and change in year two here for Tim Plow and this coaching staff overall? I think that's going to be answered here in the spring, or at least in part, moving into this season. And then talking about Hank Bachmeier, like you said, a guy who, first off, never ran an RPO-style offense, but also a quarterback who's been limited by injury, limited by COVID seasons, limited by multiple different factors. When you look at last year, he was a junior on the board. But really, when you talk about his playing time overall, he's really more of a sophomore. So this is, in this year, he is really, not just is he a senior, but he's really coming into it as a junior as far as playing experience overall. And that junior year for playing experience is when you really see quarterbacks improve. I mean, Kellen Moore's junior year was amazing. So you see guys really take that big step forward. And I think that this spring, keeping an eye on how Hank performs in the spring and what kind of improvements he's able to make, will talk big money for how Boise State's able to improve coming into next season.
Well, and the impressive thing about Hank, too, is you talk about how he's been limited, and he has been limited, but he's still top 10 all-time in program history in passing yards, top 10 all-time in program history in passing touchdowns. So there's still some promise there. And one more point on the coaching staff as well. You know, you're right that there was some growing pains last year. But if you look at the coaches they added in this offseason, they added a ton of experience. Keith Bonifaz has been around forever and coached some really, really talented guys. Papinga's been around forever and coached a laundry list of guys there in the NFL. DeMario Warren, the new cornerback coach, comes in with head coaching experience. Nate Potter's a guy who's one of the young up-and-coming coaches in this country. So, I mean, I think those coaching additions is going to pay off huge early on.
Absolutely agree. It's a focus, like we said, on spring football is always the players, but the coaching staff, in addition to not just the new coming players, but the new coming coaches and what impacts they're able to make on this team are going to be huge, and a big storyline coming into the spring. So now we've kind of previewed some of the big storylines here. Let's start talking about some of these newcomers. Now, we're going to talk about these newcomers. I'm not tracking or able to track quite as well as you are. You'll probably have more insight on this. Who was able to enroll early? Who is going to be actually a part of spring ball? So you can provide some more insight on that as we go through these names. But just overall, talking about newcomers to this team that are going to make an impact next season. This was Andy Avalos' first recruiting class here at Boise State, and it was a good one. 61st nationally, which may not sound big, but when you consider that last season was 67th and the year before that was 64th, this is actually the best recruiting class we've had since 2019. So a step in the right direction for sure, and some exciting guys on this list. Number one in the Mountain West, beat out 9 Power 5 teams, including Kansas State, North Carolina State, USC, and UVA for recruiting classes. And then also on that, as far as group of 5 teams, there were 6 group of 5 teams in front of Boise State for overall recruiting ranking, but 4 of them are going to the Power 5. So BYU, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati. So they have that kind of in transition Power 5 advantage. So the only true 2 group of 5 schools that beat out Boise State were Marshall and Memphis. So this was for especially a team that came off of a 7-win record last season, second year of a new head coaching staff. This was definitely a big step for Andy Avalos. What are your overall impressions of this class?
I think it's a strong class. And I would add to what you said. After the early signing period, they were ranked, I think, 53rd in the country. Their class was. It was one of the highest ranked classes in program history. I think it's a really strong class, top to bottom. It starts with Ashton Jeanty. If he's a success, the class is going to be a success because they've got to get that number 2 guy. They got to take some pressure off of George Holani's shoulders. And Ashton Jeanty is a guy who had an extremely productive high school career. I think as a senior, he ran for over 1,800 yards. He put up ridiculous numbers. And like I said, he passes the eyeball test. He's cut up. He's not the tallest guy in the world, but he's stout. He looks like he can take some punishment. He looks like he can carry the ball 20 times a game. They're not going to need that from him this year. But if they can get 10, 12 touches a game out of him, that's awesome. That's huge for George Holani. Look at the rest of this class. I mean, the offensive lineman that I keep hearing great things about, who's one of the early enrollees, is Cage Gacy. Big, strong kid. Tim Keene was really, really high on him when I talked to him the other day. Tim said he's really impressed in the weight room. He's already gotten a couple of snaps with the first teamers because some offensive linemen are out this spring. So he's a guy who I think is going to be really, really one to watch. There are some really talented linebackers in this class. Deshaun Misa, I mean, this kid, if he doesn't come in and play right away, I'll be surprised. If he was here in the spring, it'd be a lock in my opinion. But even in the summer, I think he's my favorite to replace Riley Wimpy at linebacker. He's long, he's smart, he can run sideline to sideline. I mean, he's got everything you look for at that position. Another freshman that's going to come in and compete right away, really contribute right away, is the Australian punter James Ferguson.
Yeah,
I think he takes the starting job, to be honest with you. Now, the rugby punting thing is a little bit gimmicky, but I mean, it gives such an advantage to the punt team, and Ferguson does that wonderful. They also have Gavin Whale on the roster, whose older brother punted for Boise State a few years ago, so that's going to be a competition there. But my money is on James Ferguson.
That's awesome. And I agree right with you there as far as especially talking about A'Shawn Jeanty. I mean, he is a guy that comes in and is exciting. I mean, especially Boise State fans, we're always excited when we can get a quality running back coming through because Boise State's always had a history of amazing running backs. And George Holani, an incredible running back who I'm excited to see what he can do with maybe a full season without injury for once. But he is a player that has been plagued with injuries throughout his career here at Boise State. So that number 2 position becomes key, especially when you talk about losing Van Buren there and Cyrus Obibilikio. You start looking at who's left. And there's some contributors that I'll talk about later when we get into the unit breakdown. There are some contributors that I think could step up. But when you're talking about that Jay Ajayi, Doug Martin, Ian Johnson level running back, past Holani, I don't know if there's anybody on there that steps up and fulfills that role in the same way. So we start looking at this true freshman who could potentially contribute, like you said, 1,843 yards, rushing 31 touchdowns in his senior season. This is a guy who knows how to score. He knows how to win. And the way, when you watch him play on the field, the way he breaks tackles, it really does remind me of Doug Martin. And he's kind of in that same kind of build as well a little bit. So definitely a player that I think can come in and contribute right away. I'm going to look at a guy for my top newcomer just because he is the highest overall recruit according to 24/7 Sports for Boise State. Like you were talking about, Deshaun Misa there. Great guy, 6'3", 220 pounds. He had 14 offers other than Boise State, and 12 of those were Power 5. Boise State and Hawaii were the only 2 group of 5s to offer him, and he came to Boise State. Now, he is a player that has been plagued by injuries his junior and senior season. He has been hobbled and limited by injuries his junior and senior season, so we'll be having to see, can he overcome that coming into this year for Boise State. But if he's able to, another guy who is built, he's college. You talk about guys that come in college built, and that you have guys that have a lot of talent and potential, but a lot of times it's having to develop that build before they can show their true potential. Well, this is a guy coming in with that already ready to play and contribute right up front. So I agree with you on both those guys as top newcomers that could potentially contribute right away. What do you think about the 2 tall wide receivers? I'm going to call these guys my most interesting prospects for Boise State, because when you look at Boise State's roster, they don't have a receiver over 6'2" on the entire roster. Cutter is the tallest receiver on their roster besides these newcomers coming in. But when you look at their top guys last year, Shakir, Cobbs, and Evans, all of them under 6'1". So something that Boise State has been missing, especially in a style of offense that likes to target those deep plays down the field, is a tall wide receiver here the last couple of seasons. So Kenan McCaddy comes in as a 3-star recruit, 6'3", and then I'm just going to say the first name because I'd mess it up if I tried to say the last name, but Prince at 6'4", both guys that are tall that I think might be able to find a way into a wide receiver room that is kind of reeling after losing most of their top guys last season. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you. They need a guy that can make a difference and win some of those 50-50 balls on the outside. One guy that's on the roster that I would keep an eye on is Eric McAllister. Yeah. He's a redshirt freshman. If I'm not mistaken, I think he is about 6'2", 6'3". I could be off on that, but he's physically impressive, and he looks like he could win some of those jump balls. McCaddy is interesting. He's got some good film, good athleticism. I think he's going to be a little bit of a project. Prince Strawn, you got to remember, is going to gray shirt, so he's not going to be here until January of 2023.
Okay, I wasn't tracking that one. Okay.
Yep. He's going to gray shirt, and there's not an injury or anything. He's just very, very raw. Prince Strong, I actually did a story on him a couple months ago, and he moved from the Bahamas. He's only played, I think, 2 or 3 years of organized football.
Wow.
His older brother Michael is a receiver for the Indianapolis Colts. He's got huge ceiling, huge upside, but he's another guy who could be a bit of a project. Here's a name that I'm going to throw out to you to watch out for as a freshman. Zamondre Merriweather. This kid, he is a freak. You watch his huddle film, and he just makes play after play after play. He's a big kid. I think he's 6'1", 6'2" as well. So he's one to look out for there. But if I had to guess, the outside guys this year, just coming into the season, you're talking about Billy Bowens, Davis Cutter, Eric McAllister. Bowens has seen a lot of snaps, hasn't seen a lot of passes come his way. Saw a few more last year, but he's kind of a long guy. I think he's 6'1", but he's deceptively long. He's got really long arms. He's got some good hops. Davis Cutter, I'm not sure. So I love that they brought Davis Cutter back. He's a smart guy. He's an experienced guy. And I don't mean this as disrespect to Davis Cutter in any way, but I think he was brought back more for what he could do in the locker room than what he could do on the field. Davis Cutter is going to be a great receiver. He's going to be kind of a possession receiver in the Keyshawn Johnson mold. You know, if I'm Tim Plow, I'm calling a whole lot of 8-yard curl routes, you know, for him. I'm on third down, I'm putting Davis Cutter in the slot and telling him to find the soft spot in the zone and just sit down. Davis Cutter, to me, I don't know if he has the athleticism to separate on the outside. I don't know if he's going to be a great jump ball guy, but he's going to be a solid possession receiver. Eric McAllister, if he can have a good spring, I think he can come in and steal some snaps and really be that down the field guy. But you're right. We're going to see a lot of Steph Cobb this year. We're going to see a lot of Latrell Capels because they're tailor-made for Tim Plow's offense. You know, Tim Plow doesn't need to force the ball down the field. He wants those quick guys that can be elusive, that can run good routes. So I think those guys, the passing game is going to run through Steph Cobbs and Latrell Capels this year.
And you're right. Thank you for correcting me on that. I actually have it written down here later. Eric McAllister, 6'3". So yeah, the one guy on the roster right now, other than Eric McAllister, that's 6'3" there. But yes, sorry. Thanks for correcting me on that with Prince. I wasn't tracking that he was gray shirting. That's why you're on here with your in-depth experience you're able to provide. But yes, I think that McCaddy was 6'3", provides some excellent height, and I like the discussion of wide receivers. We'll talk about them a little bit more when we get into our unit breakdown here. But I agree. Just to mention it real quick, Derek Cutter to me reminds me a little bit of kind of a Kirby Moore. You know, a guy who's dependable. He's going to get you the receptions out there, and he can be a leader on the team. But he's not going to be your Khalil Shakir. You know, he's not going to be your Cedric Wilson, your Titus Young, the kind of guy that's going to make the super spectacular play and blow the team away. So I like bringing Cutter back again, especially for his leadership abilities. And I thought he made some nice catches last season. But you're right. Boise State needs a big play receiver, and I think we're going to talk about that later on. I think we might have some potentials on this team, kind of talking along the same phase that you were there. Real quick here, we kind of already mentioned already, but as we're kind of wrapping up this section, talking about some of these guys, these transfers that came down. What are you talking about when you're looking at these transfers, guys who might also be able to come in and contribute?
Well, I love George Tarlis. He earned the nickname the Greek Freak when he was at Weber State, and he's had actually a really long career there. He played 5 years there. He's going to be a 6-year senior this year. He comes in with 17 career sacks. He's going to play that edge role where he's going to be kind of like a pass rusher. He's going to have to drop back and do a little bit of pass coverage, but he's a guy that has a nose for the quarterbacks. He told me that he loves to bring down the quarterback. He loves to kind of see the fear in their eyes. So in my list of those transfers, George Tarlis is the guy that comes in and plays day one. He's a plug and play guy. I think he starts on the edge. Cade Beresford, same deal. You know, he had some starting experience at guard at Washington State. He's been playing some right tackle here so far. I think there's a good chance he starts at that right tackle on opening day. And then I look at another JUCO edge guy, Devin Wright.
Devin Wright.
Physically, you know, he could be the next Tank Lawrence. You know, he's not that guy yet. Don't get me wrong, but he's 6'5", he's 220. He can bend. He can get around the edge. He's a little raw, but I mean, he's a guy that in a couple of years could be very, very good. And then the other JUCO guy, Cortez Hogan is Jr. More of a traditional defensive end, but he's 270 pounds, got good pass rush move. Again, a guy that can play against the run and rush the passer. So if I had to guess, in my opinion, Tarlis, Beresford both start day one. Devin Wright is going to be a kind of a pass rush specialist on year one. And then Cortez Hogan is going to be in that defensive rotation. You know, he's going to be in there with Shane Irwin, with Scott Matlock, with some of those guys. So we're going to see him on the field as well.
And I agree with that. I also think what we're talking about earlier with the Australian punter coming in. I was so excited. I watch Aussie punters across the league, and I love the style and the way the ball just continues to trickle down that field. I've been waiting for Boise State to get their hands on one. We finally got one coming in. Only team to offer him, but I think that he's definitely, you kind of look at those Australian punters, they don't necessarily get the same hype and recruitment that playing in the States does. So I think he's got a lot to offer. Ashton Genty here, I think he's also a guy that's going to come in and contribute. And then really any of the offensive line recruits, you look at a Boise State offensive line that struggled last season, got better as the year went on, but they still, I don't think were what you would say a top tier offensive line. I think really any of them have a chance to definitely come in and push some of those starters at that starting position. We can talk about that more later on. That's kind of my initial impressions here of some guys, and I agree with basically your perspective here, looking at those transfers that can come in and maybe be used kind of like they used Banya last year, kind of a guy they send in on the rush and a special package, go after nose for the quarterback as well. So unit breakdown, I'm going to go through the offense, the defense, and the special teams. I'm going to start here with the offense. And again, we're not going to necessarily hit every position group, but maybe some of the ones that are having the biggest battles. We mentioned the quarterback battle up front. No quarterback controversy. Hank Bachmeier is the guy. They made that clear. One of the reasons Jack Sears transferred, because he knew that there wasn't going to be a controversy. Hank Bachmeier is the starting quarterback for Boise State, and I think he's earned that. I know that fans have maybe he's been a little bit more of a controversial guy with some of those decisions that he's made late in games. But I'm wearing a Hank Bachmeier jersey right now, number 19. And he's a guy that I love. He's a guy with a lot of talent and a lot of abilities. And you look at a guy who right now already, like you said, top 10, a lot of statistical categories for Boise State. And I don't think we've even yet seen his full potential, like I said, with that limited playing time. So Hank Bachmeier, the main guy, I think there's a lot to look for in him this spring season, how he can improve. But quarterback number 2, is it the Taylon Green show? Is there someone else who could potentially emerge? What's your perspective on this?
Logic dictates it's got to be Taylon Green, for several reasons. Number one, Taylon's not the same quarterback as Sam Vidlak. Sam Vidlak is a much more conventional passer. Sam Vidlak's a guy that's going to kind of play a cerebral game. He can run a little bit, but he's not the kind of athlete that Taylon Green is. Taylon Green is 6'6", every bit of 215. Every coach I talk to says he's one of, if not the fastest guy on the field. And in an RPO offense, that kind of quarterback can do a lot of damage. Once you get those defensive ends guessing about who's getting the ball, and he sees a little lane, he can go and he can rack up a lot of yards. The question for Taylon is, where is he in the playbook right now in terms of his grasp and understanding? And does he pass the ball well enough to really take on that role? His throwing motion is not beautiful. He's got kind of that weird Vince Young kind of half sidearm motion. He's not as accurate as some of the other guys, but his athleticism, man, is just off the charts. And when I talked to Tim Plow yesterday, he said it's night and day this year from last year in terms of his understanding of the offense. Tim Plow said last year they couldn't even run 2 or 3 plays in a row with Taylon Green because he just didn't know enough of the offense. This year, he's got the playbook down. He understands the terminology. He understands his job. So in my opinion, Taylon Green's got to be that number 2 guy. And, I'll also throw this out there. Hank Bachmeier is more than likely not going anywhere after this year. Hank Bachmeier's got at least 1 more year of eligibility left. I don't see him going early to the NFL draft. So if Taylon Green doesn't get serious snaps this year, is he going to hang around for another year, or is he going to hit the transfer portal? In this atmosphere of college football, I don't see him sticking around for 2 more years. I see him hitting that portal if he doesn't get any time this year. So I think Boise State's going to have some very specific packages for Taylon Green this year. They're not going to put him out there on a 3rd down in an obvious passing situation. But if you need a 3rd and 1, 4th and 1, if you need to just throw a curveball out there, why not put that guy out there? So I think we'll see him, maybe 2, 3, 4 snaps a game, but very specific packages.
Well, and you look at Hank Bachmeier and his abilities, which he has a lot of strong abilities. I think he is a great quarterback here for Boise State. But you look at the areas that he struggles in, it's those short yardage, especially the red zone. Red zone is where Hank Bachmeier really seems to kind of get stuck in the mud, kind of get into his own head and force some of those bad decisions. Because honestly, Hank Bachmeier, he's an athletic guy, but he's not what you would call a running quarterback. That's not his primary strength. He can get out there and move, but he's not a primarily running quarterback. And so he's really kind of limited to the passing game once you get into the red zone, primarily for his style of play. And it's something that I was calling for all last season, was to work in some packages not just for Taylor Green, but also for Jack Sears, who was more of a pro style guy who I thought could potentially contribute on those short yardages. And it's not something we saw last season. So this coaching staff taking a step forward into year two, getting themselves underneath them here, learning their positions at this level of college football. It takes a veteran, a disciplined and experienced coaching staff to know when is the time to pull your guy out and substitute in that package deal. And I think that's why we didn't see this coaching staff necessarily doing that last season. This season, completely different story. I think that we will see, like you said, there's a consideration to Taylor Green trying to keep him around. Also, you don't want to waste his athletic abilities on the bench. So I think that we will see, in addition to some changes overall in this offense, I think that we will see Taylor Green having a package deal in this offense. But just talking about some of these other quarterbacks here real quick, just make sure we don't close the door quite on them yet. Like you said, Sam Vidlac, we've got Andy Peters, Colton Fitzgerald, and Colt Fulton. You don't think that any of those guys might potentially have a leg and a chance to get into this race?
Selfishly as a writer, I think I'd like to happen because it'd be great stories.
Yeah.
Colton Fitzgerald, Colt Fulton, both of them joined the program late last summer. Andy Peters is a walk-on. He's a local guy. He started at Timberline High School as a star there. So it'd be great stories. I'm just not sure it's realistic. Now that being said, who knows? Kellen Moore was a little bit under the radar when he first got to Boise State. Colton Fitzgerald throws a pretty ball, man. His delivery is pretty. He's accurate. He's got decent size. I'm just not sure that he has that athleticism yet to really jump over to Taylor Green or even to Sam Vidlac, who's a little more dual threat than he seems. Like he can run a little bit.
Right.
So I just don't think we've seen enough of those guys. I don't think they've seen enough. They haven't played enough ball. So I'd be shocked if one of those guys ended up in that role unless there was an injury. You can't really predict that.
Well, and talking about injury, people might be saying, okay, why are we having this discussion about QB number 2? Why is that so important? Well, this is a Boise State offense that, first off, has dealt with quarterback injury in the past. And also it's an offense that still, until I'm proven otherwise, does not have a solid offensive line underneath it. I mean, that's going to be one of the big questions coming into this season is, can they improve the offensive line? Hank Bachmeier takes a lot of hits. Now, some of those, maybe a good 50% are his fault because he holds onto the ball for too long and plays that hero ball and tries to get it down the field where maybe he should just throw it away. But another part of that is that he has no time in the pocket and is getting slammed to the turf a lot of times. So this is a quarterback system where you have a solid guy, but it's a position where you need to have a solid backup who can come in, even if it's just for a couple snaps while your starter kind of gets his breath back after getting knocked to the turf. You need to have a solid starter in position number 2. And Boise State's always really had that. They've always had a guy in number 2 that can come in. I mean, you start talking about not just Jack Sears, you go back to Jalen Henderson. I mean, they've had a guy who can come in and play strong in that position for them. This is a guy, like you talk about Hank Bachmeier. I'm not necessarily sold on him sticking around after this season. I think if he has a really good year, he could start hearing the calls of the draft. So I will defer. I will hope. I'm rooting for your opinion that he sticks around. Absolutely. And I think he's a player with high character. But I think that if he has a really good year, he's taken a lot of hits, and especially if that offensive line doesn't improve drastically, he might start looking kind of like Jay Ajayi did, starts looking and saying, okay, how much am I getting beat up? Maybe I take the call for the next level if it's being offered to me. So either way, that number 2 position is going to be key for Boise State here and finding a solid guy. Let's move on to the running back discussion, because I think this is an even more important area where, yes, again, we've got a solid runner in Halani, there's no running back controversy. He's going to be number 1 guy, but especially in the Boise State system, it's not a system where it's just one powerhouse back. They have always, even when they've had that powerhouse back, have always mixed in the running backs. And it's something that Tim Powell looks like he wants to continue to do, is to have 1, maybe 2 or 3 guys that he can mix into that running back rotation. So big storylines here. Van Buren and Cyrus Habibulikio both gone from the program. Now it's left to George Halani. When you look at the guys behind him, we've already talked about Gentry. I know I keep messing up his name. Once he starts getting on the field, I'm used to it. Regular viewers will know name pronunciation is not my strong point. But Ashton there, freshman, we've kind of talked in depth about him as well, but also Tyler Crow, a guy that saw a lot of action last season, actually rushed for 108 yards, has a touchdown, 5.1 yards per carry. Now, a lot of that was late in games against the second string players, but he looks to me like a Van Buren kind of guy that can get his nose out there, He's a bigger guy, 5'11", 220 pounds. So he's a guy that can go out there at the goal line potentially and push you in for the last couple of yards. Queen Tyler, a guy that was speedster, kind of reminded me a little bit of a Devin Demas kind of guy. Not necessarily saying he's as fast as Devin Demas, but he showed some good jets out there on the outside, rushed for 47 yards. And then Danny Smith is also a guy that's on the roster that might be able to try and push for some playing time, and saw some last season with 17 yards rushing. So we've kind of summarized what we're looking at here. Who's your guy? I mean, you've kind of talked about Janchi. Do you think any of these other guys have a chance to, maybe not number two, but build a role for themselves in this offense?
I think Tyler Crow has a chance. Tyler Crow is kind of a, again, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but a poor man's Andrew Van Buren. He's not quite as big. Andrew Van Buren was 240 pounds, really hard to bring down. But I think Tyler Crow is going to be that short yardage guy this year. And he's a great story. He's a local kid, played at Skyview High in Nampa. He walked on, earned a scholarship just last year. Really, really great story. I think he's going to see some more carries this year. I'm curious about Taekwon Tyler. He's a JUCO transfer. He's been here for 2 years now. Has barely seen the field. He missed the 2020 season with a Achilles tendon injury. But he's got a lot of hype. You're right. He's elusive. He's got some wiggle. He's quick, but we just haven't seen it. So I can't really speak to him. Danny Smith is a guy that's been on this roster forever. I feel like he's like 30, 35 years old at this point and hasn't seen much. So I don't really know what to say about Danny Smith other than, I'm sure he's a nice guy. I want to go back to George Holani for a second, though. You were talking about the potential of Hank Bachmeier leaving after next year with a big year. That danger is much bigger with George Holani. But you look at a guy like George Holani, he's already got some tread on the tires, injuries the past 2 years. If he comes out this year and has a 1,000-yard season, I think he's gone. I think he goes early in the draft. And he's that kind of athlete, man. He's just a freak athlete. Yeah. Whenever he touches the ball, it's just a different kind of guy. He always falls forward. The first tackler almost never gets him. Some of that's because of his rugby background. He played rugby for much of his life when he was young, and that really helped him. So he's going to have a big year, and I think if I had to put a percentage on it right now, I'd say 80% chance that George Holani is not here next year. And this is the Ashton Jeanty show. I really, Boise State needs to give George Holani a minimum of 20 touches a game. If he's healthy, he needs to touch the ball. And now that doesn't necessarily mean carries. He catches the ball well out of the backfield as well. So he just needs the ball in his hand at least 20 times a game. And if they can get 10 touches a game out of Ashton Jeanty, that's awesome. But if he can do that as a freshman, then he's going to be ready for next year. So it's definitely the Holani and Jeanty show. And then there's a big gap between Jeanty and Tyler Crow there at the third spot. But Crow is my guy to be on the short yardage downs.
And I agree. I think, like you said at the beginning, Boise State is a completely different team when Holani is out there. I mean, when you look at Boise State and some of the losses that they had, a big part of that was just because of Holani and even early Khalil Shakir being injured and not being out there at 100% strength. So when you look at a Boise State team they went 7-5, but they had a lot of their key starters injured. It wasn't the full Boise State team that we saw out there for a good part of the season. And when those guys came back, they were a very, very different team. And we saw really, I think, Boise State on full display against Fresno State when Holani was back out there, really playing at his best. And I agree with you. I'm not saying necessarily needs to be Jay Ajayi where we're giving him the ball like 30 times a game. But I think that we need to find a way to get Holani more involved in this offense, get him involved in the passing game because he has great hands, and find a way to get Holani more involved. But then with that, there comes more wear and tear. He's going to be out there longer. So you need to have a guy who's going to be a good, not necessarily a change of pace guy, but someone who can come in and pick up at the same level. And I think when you look at the guys on the roster, unless Tyler can show something that he hasn't yet, I think Ashton has a really good chance to be that guy. And when you start talking about a team that might be without Holani going to next season, which I'm just going to say this would be very, very sad for Boise State because not just are we losing a great player, but we haven't had a chance to really take advantage of what Holani brings to the table. I mean, you look at Doug Martin, you look at Jay Ajayi, you look at Mick Nichols. Those guys had, a couple of seasons of high performance that we really got to take advantage and see what they brought to the table. And it would be unfortunate to have that one great year and then he's gone. I think it would not damage his legacy in any way, but I think that he could definitely build on some things that could establish themselves more in Boise State history if we could just see a couple more seasons with him. But that's selfishness as a fan versus what he really is best for him as a player. But yeah, I think that you're right. Tyler Crow, a guy that we need to use in package situations. But when you look at this roster, we're trying to build towards next season. Who can be that guy to take over the reins and try to get them that experience? The guy with the most potential here really is Ashton. And I think that we're looking at potentially potentially a true freshman out there having a big role, which is always exciting as fans.
Absolutely.
So let's roll into the wide receivers here, because I think that of all the position battles really on this team, the wide receiver one, I think, not necessarily for who's at number one, because I think you're right. I think Cobbs and Latrell Caples are going to be the two guys that step up and become that kind of number one receiver. But the wide receiver room as a whole, it has a lot of potential depth. You look at these guys with what they brought to the table and what their potential is. But when you look at the actual yardage coming back and the statistics, it doesn't have a lot of actual depth right now on the field. So we're looking at a wide receiver room that I think is going to be one of the most exciting position battles to watch in the spring. Is who steps up and becomes that new guy. You kind of talked about them already, but Stephon Cobbs, the only receiver from the top four wide receivers for Boise State to return this year. So as total yardage, the only of the top four returns, so 421 yards and 5 touchdowns. Latrell Caples only had 56 yards last season, but he's shown a lot of potential. When he gets the ball in his hands, even though it wasn't very many times last season, it is exciting. He has some great moves out there. And then you talk about Cutter, you talk about Bowens, guys who have been dependable targets, but not necessarily blow the top off an offensive guy. So let's talk real quick here about some of those wild cards, some of those guys that are out there. You've already mentioned Eric McAllister, Ben Ford, Caden Dudley. All those guys are on the roster. They're coming into redshirt seasons that they've had and shown some experience last season, growing, not getting stats, but practicing with this team and getting part of this offense. Let's talk a little bit about this wide receiver room and what we might see.
Sure, yeah. So let's start at the top. Steph Cobbs, I mentioned it earlier. He looks jacked this year. I mean, he's put on at least 5-10 pounds, and we saw it last year. He has a knack for getting behind the defense. He's going to be that big play guy, that stretch the field, deep pass guy. After him, Latrell Caples is just a freak athlete, man. You go back and watch his high school film, and it's just scary good. Like they could not tackle him. He's a guy that can turn a 5-yard pass into an 80-yard touchdown really easily. I'm sure he's a low 4.40 guy. I mean, he had a knee injury early in his career that kind of slowed him down, but we really saw him come on at the second half of last season. And I think about the San Diego State finale. Latrell had 2 huge catches in that game. One of them on the sideline, very much a Khalil Shakir-esque acrobatic catch where he tapped the toe down. So his promise is huge. We talked about Eric McAllister, Davis Cutter. There are going to be some outside guys. Billy Bowens is a guy who I think has a chance to take a big step in this offense and really, really take that outside role early on. 2 guys that I think are sleepers that you mentioned, Ben Ford and Caden Dudley. Both of them are similar guys. Ben Ford's another guy who put on a lot of weight in the offseason. He had to put on at least 10 pounds. Dudley is just a shifty little athlete, man. I think both those guys are slot-type receivers. Both those guys, plus Caples and Cobbs, are going to contribute on special teams. So I think we're going to see those names quite a bit. I'll throw a name out there for who's going to have a make it or break it year, in my opinion. Shea Whiting. He's a guy who's been on this roster for a long time. He came in with a lot of promise. Another Texas guy, had some great high school film, but just hasn't really found his footing. So I just especially given the scholarship situation where the COVID year just screwed everything up numbers wise. If Shea Whiting doesn't have a big year this year, I'm not sure if he's back next year. Maybe they don't ask him back next year, to be honest with you, because they got to find ways to make this roster work. So I think he's got to have a big year. But Steph Cobbs, man, it's going to be the Steph Cobbs show this year, I think.
And I think you look at the comparisons between Steph Cobbs and Khalil Shakir, and while they're not the same player, there are some similarities there with their abilities to make moves in the open field, that shiftiness, the good route running. I think you have some similarities there that maybe Boise State won't lose too much of a step. It's once you get past that, not necessarily just the number one guy, but you get past that first 1 or 2 guys, you start looking at the rest of the roster. You try to start finding those guys that can make those big plays down the field. And that's where the question marks are going to come into the season. I like Billy Bowens a lot. I like that we used him. I liked him the season before, some of the limited action he saw as well. So I like Billy Bowens and what he's able to bring to the table. But I think he could be kind of a Geraldo Boldevine kind of player where he can stretch the field and be that kind of third option, especially for some of those deep balls, because there was a couple plays last year where he was open and Hank Bachmeier overthrew him, and it would have just been a beautiful pass. But he runs a good route. He's got some good top end speed. And like you said, he's sneakily big as well. So I'm excited to see what these guys can do coming into it. Moving down the last list here, tight ends and offensive line. Real quick, because I want to get into the defense here, but what do you have to say really about the tight end and offensive line positions here? I mean, tight end, we've got a lot of returners coming back. I mean, between all the tight ends, we have let's see, between all the tight ends returning, we have 313 yards of receiving and 4 touchdowns coming back with Riley Smith, Tyler Hopper, and Kurt Rafdell, all guys who had a big impact last season with their tight ends kind of returning to preeminence in this offense, which has always been the Boise State way, I think, is mixing in the tight ends and using them as part of that receiving game. And I think I would like that about Tim Plow, the way he brought that back into a focus for this offense. Do you think the tight ends take a bigger role, and do you think that we might see some changes in spring practice and the way the offense is run?
I think so. On the tight ends, as we talked about, there's not an overwhelming amount of experience in the wide receiver room. Yeah, I mean, we talk about this tight end class. There is just a ton of experience. Riley Smith, Tyler Hopper, both are redshirt seniors. Riley Smith comes in; he's a former quarterback. Both those guys have really seen their roles improve the last 2 years. Tyler Hopper, especially last year, he had a stretch of 5 games where he had at least 1 catch. He had that 50-yard touchdown catch against Colorado State. So I think he's a guy that could take a big step. You mentioned Kurt Rafdell, the Nebraska transfer. He's
6'7".
Yeah, right. Ridiculous. He caught his first career touchdown pass last year. So he's a guy that I think could see some time. And, there's some other tight ends on this roster that can see some minutes. It sounds crazy to say, but, man, Russell Corrigan, redshirt freshman, he looks big, man. He is physically ready to go. He's a guy that I think could come in and really, really make a name for himself in the run blocking area. Matthew Louder's another one in very much the same vein. And let me throw out the name that everyone loves, Austin Bolt.
Yeah.
Now, Austin Bolt, former Boris star, amazing athlete in high school. He's listed on the roster as a tight end, but we saw it last year. He was tight end. He was a wide receiver. He was a defensive end. Already this year, he was working out with the wide receivers in spring practice yesterday.
Wow.
Austin Bolt is really a wild card wherever he goes. I don't know if he's going to line up at the tight end. In my opinion, he's still a little too small to play tight end. He just doesn't have the frame to put on 20 or 30 pounds. I think eventually Austin Bolt becomes a slot receiver and a darn good one. I mean, a really good one. He's an athletic kid. But this year, it's going to be the Riley Smith and Tyler Hopper show. I'm really excited about them. Both those guys are experienced. They both run good routes. They have good hands. They're big enough to make a difference in the run game. So I think it's going to be their year.
And I'm excited for that too. I mean, Riley Smith was a guy who he only had 1 touchdown last season, but he could have had 6. I mean, there were at least 4 or 5 overthrows where he was wide open, where Hank Bachmeier just not on the same page with Riley Smith last season. So again, like you said, former quarterback, a smart guy. I would like to, I mean, we haven't seen it yet, but there's always that option where you've got a guy out there playing receiver or tight end who is able to throw the ball, where you might get a double pass going. I mean, our fans have been yelling that for so long, and maybe the other coaching staffs know, the opposing teams know that as well. So maybe that's why we haven't seen it. But I would love, the more we get into his hands, the more used to the other teams get to seeing him with the ball in his hands, the less likely they are to kind of bite in on that potential double pass. So yeah, the more Riley Smith can get involved, the happier I think Boise State fans will be.
How about this? I mean, the most Boise State play of all time, a trick play where Riley Smith throws a touchdown pass to Scott Matlock. That's the greatest thing. Like that's a story in itself. I hope that happens next year.
Absolutely. Well, before we move on to the defense, we kind of already talked in depth about the offensive line. We kind of mentioned them throughout. So I don't have anything specific to add here, but if you have anything you want to add on the offensive line before we move on, you can, or we can just skip on to defense.
I do have some points in the offensive line.
Sure, yeah.
I think there's some optimism there this year. I mean, you look at this group, there's 6 guys back that have starting experience. That in itself is huge. John Ojukwu at left tackle is going to be a 5-year starter at tackle. John Ojukwu is a quiet, soft-spoken guy. He's not very intimidating to speak to, but you can't be a 5-year starter at a high-end Division I program and not have that switch that you turn on game day. So I think he has a chance to not only have a great year, but be a potential draft pick next year, to be honest with you. You look at the rest of the line. So if the season started tomorrow, my projected starting offensive line would be Ojukwu at left tackle, Curran at left guard, KHG, I'm not even going to try and say it, Halo Malia Gonzalez at center, Ben Dooley at right guard, and Cade Beresford at right tackle.
Okay.
The great thing about that is you've got some really experienced guys, especially in the interior of that line, to use as backups. Will Farah, the Texas Tech transfer, played guard and center last year. He'll be able to do the same thing this year. A young lineman that I keep hearing about, Mason Randolph.
Yeah,
the coaches love him. He's big, strong, athletic, smart. I don't know that he starts this year, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him get some snaps. So I think there's some promise there. I think the offensive line could take a huge step forward this year.
And Mason Randolph, a guy that was one of my top recruits coming in for Boise State last season when I previewed the team, and I would love to see him get more involved because, like you said, a guy when we talk about guys that are built for college level, he's built for college level, and a guy that's definitely, I think, has a chance to make a big impact on this offensive line. And Boise State fans, or not just Boise State fans, but Boise State in general. Boise State is built off of a good running game and a good passing game. I mean, all teams are, but especially Boise State, when you start talking about having those 1,000-yard rushers and having that quarterback can throw it deep, both of those build off of having a strong offensive line. And it's something that really going not just in the last season, but we saw 2020 and kind of a little bit in 2019. But all those years returned a lot of offensive linemen, and yet the offensive line production quality has gone down. So Andy Avalos, I think he's took a big step forward in addressing the defense, which was a big concern coming out of the 2020 season. The next area of focus is the offensive line, and it's something that he hit heavy in the recruiting area as well. So a great discussion on the offense there. We're going to get into the defense here real quick. We're going to sum up and kind of talk about the defensive line. I'm going to kind of break into three categories here. I'm going to talk about the defensive line, the linebackers / DNs, because Boise State's DNs are really more outside linebackers in the way that they run their defense. So defensive line, linebackers / DNs, and then we'll just group the secondary all together and talk about the safeties, free safeties, and corners all together in that section as well, if that's okay. All right, so defense, a defense that I've already talked about already. It took a big step forward last season. You look at 2020, 6 turnovers total, 3 interceptions, and 3 forced fumbles. Well, last season, they were able to put up it was amazing. 12, sorry. I totally missed track where I wrote down the stat. 13 interceptions and 11 forced fumbles. So a defense that had 3 interceptions, 13 interceptions. The team before that, 3 forced fumbles and then 11 forced fumbles. That is not just improvement. That is radical change and radical turnaround, which when we're talking about coaches and new coaching staffs coming in and the big names were getting tossed around, Kellen Moore and a lot of these other guys, those guys would have been great. And obviously, as a Boise State fan, I'd love to have Kellen Moore back. But the main issue with this team coming into last season was the defense. And I kept saying, if we're not going to get Kellen Moore, we need a defensive mind. And Andy Avalos filled that role perfectly. And I think what he did with this defense, increasing those turnovers and increasing the focus on this defense, as a former defensive player himself, former linebacker there, he really was able to come in and turn the culture of the defensive around to being that hard-charging, hard-nosed defense that puts fear into opposing offenses. So let's talk about that defense. Defensive line that was great. A little bit of struggle at the beginning of the season, but then got much better there midway to the end of the season. I mean, you had the games where they were holding the rushing to under 100 yards rushing there. So the defensive line that definitely got good at the run stopping, but weren't necessarily able to translate that into quarterback pressure. Can we see some changes in that? We've already talked about Madlock and Cravens. Is there anybody else on this defensive line that you think could step up and kind of fill a role here as far as kind of increasing that quarterback pressure and continuing the success of the run stop overall?
I definitely do. I think Shane Irwin comes in and plays a big role again this year. Shane is not an overly big guy. He's probably 250, 255, but he's just got a motor that doesn't stop. 2 years ago, he came in here and led the team with 6.5 sacks his first year on the field. And it's because he's not a guy that relies on one pass rushing move. If his first move doesn't work, he's got a second move. He's got a third move. He's spinning. He's getting off the ground. Like, he's a guy that just never stops. So I think he's going to have another big year. Cortez Hogan's Jr., the JUCO transfer, I think he's going to play a huge role in the run stopping. But really, the beauty of this defensive line this year is the depth in the interior. Last year, Matlock got forced to play that nose roll a little bit more than he wanted to. Cravens got forced to play that nose roll. That's not going to happen this year. Herbert Gums can play the nose. Divine Obacheri can play the nose. That Cravens being there on the nose, that's going to allow them to move Scott Matlock around. He can play that defensive end on the strong side. He can play that 3-tech on the weak side. Like he can really make a lot of moves there. And so I think he's going to have a great one. Herbert Gums is a guy that I'm really, really excited about, man. He's 6'2", not overly tall, but he's every bit of almost 290, 300 pounds, just a freak athlete. He's going to play a lot of nose this year. Another freak athlete that's kind of hanging in the wings there is Ahmed Hassanin. Came in last year. He's a guy that's 250, 260. He was ranked worldwide in CrossFit as a high schooler at 250 pounds. He's just got upside out the wazoo. So I think he's going to have a huge year this year defensive line-wise. And Jackson Cravens is a guy that came on really well last year. Former Utah transfer. Actually, he's somehow related to Kyle Whittingham, the former Utah coach.
Oh, wow, okay.
Say nephew, maybe. I might be saying the wrong, but I know they're related somehow. I think he's going to have another good year this year. As you look at the defense as a whole last year, I got a little bit burned early on because I thought they were going to be great. But first 4 or 5 games of the season, they struggled to stop the run big time. But man, after the bye week last year, that certainly changed. For the whole month of October, they held teams to under 100 rushing yards a game. The defense just came to life last year. So I think there's some promise there. I think Scott Matlock's in for a big year. Shane Irvin's in for a big year. Herbert Gums is going to see a lot more playing time. And we're going to see a lot more of a rotation this year. We're going to see 4, 5, 6 D linemen get snaps every game.
I saw on your Twitter today that Irwin is dealing with some injuries. He's not participating fully in spring practice, ankle surgery or something like that. How do you think that will impact? I mean, you talk about depth. You talk about guys that are ready to step up. Do you think that might impact his ability to have the impact he wants to with so many guys ready to fill the role?
He's expected to be ready to go by fall camp.
Okay.
I think he'll be good after spring. He's doing some minimum workouts now. He's just not doing the full contact stuff right now.
Okay.
But it's a great chance for young guys like Cortez Hokins to get some snaps. Guys like Herbert Gums to maybe get some snaps. Defense Ben Hasney to get some snaps there. I just think there's a lot of depth in that room. And I think they're going to see a lot of time.
I'm glad you mentioned Obucheri because he, for me, is one of the most exciting players with some of the most upside on this team. I remember that 15-yard sack he had against Fresno State. I mean, he just ran him down the background and threw him to the ground. That was one of those big, flip your chair in the air moments. So I'm looking forward to seeing him potentially get a bigger role as well. But like you said, it's a lot of depth in this defensive line, which is a good thing for Boise State. It'll be interesting to see how he can work his way in there. Talking about the linebackers, we kind of already mentioned a little bit here, but talking about the linebackers and D ends overall. All eyes on who? Obviously, Boise State's always had that number one kind of linebacker, that number one player on the defense has usually been that linebacker position that draws all the attention. You're going back Lawrence, Van Der Esch, Curtis Weaver, and then Wimpy last season kind of filling that role as that number one guy. Who do you think now becomes that number one linebacker who kind of builds the pressure, brings the pressure? Is that the position that's going to have that, or is it going to be somewhere else on this team?
Well, let's break the linebackers down. You've got your traditional backers in this defense, and you've got your edge backers. Okay.
Yeah.
So your traditional backers, middle backer is going to be Ezekiel Noah. Lots of game experience. Is he perfect? No. He drops his head a little bit too much. He misses a few too many tackles. But he's going to be a fifth-year starter. He's got the chance to really lead the defense in tackles this year, and that's what you want as a defensive coordinator. It's great to see J.L. Skinner rack up 92 tackles, but if your safety is leading your defense in tackles, it means your front seven is not doing its job. So Ezekiel Noah's got to have a big year, and then they got to figure out how to replace Riley Wimpy. Riley Wimpy, again, not a perfect player. Not an overly amazing athlete, but a smart guy. A really consistent guy. Led the team in tackles 2 years in a row. A 5-year starter. Not easy to replace. They got some experience behind him. Brandon Hawkins has been there for a few years. He saw some snaps last year. He's done some good things. We talked about Deshaun Misa coming in. I think, in my opinion, Misa takes that job right away. They got some other young linebackers. Jai Jones, Rajon Tatum, both who came in last year. Jones is banged up and not taking part in spring ball, but Tatum's going to get a lot of snaps. He's listed on the roster as a middle backer, but there's no reason he can't slide over and play that weak side backer if he has a big spring, big fall. So those are some names I'd keep an eye on there. As you get to the edge guys, we're going to go back to those transfers. George Tarlis is going to start on the edge from day one, in my opinion. You've got Isaiah Banya there. You've got Demetri Washington there. We love those guys, but neither one of those guys is George Tarlis. George Tarlis is going to be a 6-year senior. He's seen a lot of ball. I talked to his former position coach at Weber State a couple of months ago, and he said he's fully developed. He's a plug-and-play guy ready to go. So I see him seeing a lot of snaps. Isaiah Banya excites me. He's long. He's athletic. I think he's 6'5", 220, 230. We've seen some spurts out of him. He had, I think, 6 sacks last year, but three of those sacks came in one game, if I'm not mistaken. So he hasn't been consistent yet. He's got some growth. When I asked Kelly Papinga the other day what Isaiah Banya needs to do to take the next step, he said he needs to live in the weight room. He's just got to get bigger. He's got to get stronger. He's got to get more consistent. And again, Isaiah Banya is a guy that's, somewhat raw. He came from Canada. He played a few years of high school ball in Canada, but the Canadian game is not the same as the American game. It's very stereotypically, the Canadians are very polite in football.
Don't tell Canadian bacon that, but yeah.
Isaiah's coaches last year told me but when he first came here, he would have a big hit in practice and then apologize to the guy and pick him up. Like, no, don't do that. Just play full steam ahead, And so when that really clicks for Banya, he's gonna be a solid guy. Demetri Washington's one that's interesting for me. I love Demetri, great athlete. If you know his story, man, he played almost every position when he was in high school. He came in with a lot of hype. A lot of people really thought he was going to replace Curtis Weaver as that next great pass rusher. Hasn't happened yet. He's had some injury concerns. He had the ACL in 2020. That was still slowing him down last year. In my opinion, Demetri Washington is a great player, but I don't know if he's a great edge player. I don't know if Demetri Washington is that twitchy athlete that you want on the edge. In my opinion, Demetri would be better served to put 10, 15 pounds on and play more of a traditional defensive end role. Right. So I really think this is a make it or break it year for Demetri Washington. Again, we talked about the scholarship situation. We talked about the number situation. If Demetri doesn't put up some numbers this year, do they ask him back next year? I don't know. He's got a COVID year left. I don't know if they ask him back, especially with what else they've been bringing in on the edge. Right. Now, we talked about Devin Wright earlier. I don't know that Devin steps in and plays right away, but Devin Wright, when you get to third down, he's a guy that you come in there and say, hey, don't think about anything but rushing that passer. He's going to be a pass rush specialist. So I think he has a chance. But in my opinion, day one, your starting edges are George Tarlas and Isaiah Banya.
And I like that. I like George Tarlas as well. I like Banya being on the field because I think part of the reason you saw us maybe not as consistent is that he also wasn't on the field as much. I mean, there was so much competition for that position that he wasn't necessarily getting the playing time that I think maybe he should have. I met his parents prior to the UCF game, was talking with them prior to that as well. Great kid, great family, but he's a player that has when you talk about players, you talk about their size, obviously. That's a big contributing factor to how well they're able to perform. And maybe he doesn't necessarily have, the coaches talking about that weight room issue, maybe not necessarily having the same size as what you'd want from that linebacker. But he is a player that has the character. He has the nose for the ball. When you see him out there, he is playing with 100% energy. He's fighting through, 1, 2, 3 blocks to go out and get the quarterback. So when I look at players, I look at not just what they bring to the table size-wise, but also what that work ethic is, that blue-collar work ethic, which I think for Boise State, they've not always been able to go out and get those bigger 4 or 5-star recruits. They built themselves, especially talking this early Fiesta Bowl years, they built themselves on the under-evaluated, smaller players that came in with the right work ethic. And Andy Avalos, he's that kind of guy who looks not necessarily for what your stats show, but what you bring to the table as a player and as a character overall. I think Banya is one of those players who's able to do that. So I would like to see him take up a bigger role in this defense. I think he has a lot to contribute. And 6 sacks last season, I think with an increased role, he could definitely improve upon that going into next year as well.
One more thing I would say about this edge group is that Kelly Papiga specializes in finding long, lanky pass rushers. Yeah. That's what he did at Virginia. At Virginia, the past 2 years, he had Charles Snowden, who was a 6'6" freak athlete who only played a couple of years of organized football and is now on the Chicago Bears roster. And he had Noah Taylor, who is 6'5", 240, and recently transferred to UNC. So he's got that guy in Isaiah Banya when it comes to the length. He's just got to find that consistency.
Right. And I like that analysis on that. I think that you're talking about a position group that you talk about the defensive line being the deepest. You talk about the linebacker core potentially having the most, maybe the most upside here, that not necessarily having the same depth in every position across that linebacker unit, but you're talking about a lot of guys that have a lot of potential and upside that showed that last season. And of course, Andy Avalos, that's his position group. That's what he's going to focus on. And I think he's shown that in the recruiting, bringing in some exciting recruits. I think that if you don't have to worry about the linebackers being a focus because he's going to make sure that they're going out there and performing and doing what they need to do. So I would like to see the linebackers be a bigger part of this quarterback pressure. I think that's going to be a big part. And you start looking at guys that can do that. And I think Banya is a big part of that as well. But then, of course, you start looking at the guys that they're bringing in. And there's some big potential stars there within the new freshman class coming in and within the transfers. So I'm excited about what this linebacker core can bring to the table. Now let's start talking about a position group that maybe is hopefully a little bit more consistent this season. You talk about the secondary here, great at turnovers. And overall, I think they benefited from facing a lot of teams that weren't necessarily quarterback heavy. A lot of teams that were maybe bigger built into that run game. But their turnovers were great. They played big. What I like to call Boise State defense last season was big play defense. They looked out there, they took risks, and they made some big plays, but they also allowed a lot of big plays on defense as well. So now the question becomes, how do we translate that great turnover style defense into also a consistent coverage unit overall? We're looking at guys returning here. Kaniho, the younger, coming back. So his brother is gone, but he's still here. 43 tackles, 2 interceptions. You've got Caleb Biggers coming back with 34 tackles. You've got, and then you start talking about safeties here with Reed, 21 tackles, Strike LaBeouf, 3 interceptions, leading the safeties there. And then also, of course, JL Skinner. He is going to be, I think he's definitely a first round draft pick. I think that he's definitely got that potential for a late first round, not early second round style of player, if he can avoid the penalty box, if he can avoid getting into the targeting fouls. And I think a lot of those were unfair. Kind of refs seem to be targeting him on those, but if he can keep up that style of aggressiveness and avoid the targeting fouls, I think that he's going to have another great season this year. What's your perspective on this overall secondary?
Well, let's start with JL Skinner. I mean, I honestly, the targeting penalties look bad, but I don't think the coaches mind them that much. They would rather him be playing overly aggressive, playing 100 miles downfield. That's what you need from JL Skinner. JL Skinner is the most obvious draft pick on this team for next year. No doubt about that. He's got the size, 6'4", 215, 220. He showed that he can hit. Tyreek Jones and JL Skinner were the most improved tacklers on this team by far last year. They had bad misses in the first couple of games, and by the second half of the season, they were crushing dudes out there. So I think those two guys have a chance to be one of the best safety duos in the Mountain West for sure, maybe in the country. I think they have a chance to be one of the best safety duos in Boise State history as well. They're both physical. They both need to improve their ball skills some, but they both can come downhill. They can both hit guys. They're great tacklers. Now, I think they're going to have big seasons. And then you look at the cornerback room. They actually returned a lot this year. Markel Reed was their top cornerback last year. I know he had the injury and missed a lot of the year, but he's going to – I see him as a number 1 guy again. Tyreek LaBeouf, Caleb Biggers, they're going to be in there running for number 2. Caleb Biggers is a guy that I really like. He transferred from Bowling Green last year. He came in with 19 career starts. He played tough. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he played a solid game. Tyreek LaBeouf was interesting. He led the team with 3 interceptions last year. He had a freak injury, a mystery injury that we don't know about yet that cost him most of the season, but he's going to be back in that running. Kaniho, too, is an interesting guy. He's missing spring right now. He's got his right arm in a sling. So he's not practicing now, but he's long, he's lanky, he's just like his brother. I think he'll be in that mix. If I had to guess, our opening day starters at corner are going to be Markel Reed and Caleb Biggers, with LaBeouf and Kaniho as that second tier guys. Another name to keep an eye out for is Isaiah Bradford. He gray shirted last year. So he's in this year. He's a little bit banged up already this spring. So he's kind of a slight frame guy, but man, he's an athlete, dude. We saw him in the spring game last year. He got some snaps in the first half of the spring game, played really, really well. I think he can work his way into that mix as well. And one more guy at corner to remember is Jared Reed. Yeah. He transferred in last year from Utah State. He's a very experienced guy. I mean, he's a 4th-year guy, I believe. He started his career at Portland State, transferred to Utah State, missed last year with an injury, but the coaches are really high on him. He's got great size, 6 foot, 6'1". He's got some good experience, good athleticism. So they're really deep in corner of the draft. I think the secondary could be much improved last year, especially at the cornerback position.
Yeah, and I accidentally said LaBeouf was a safety. I meant to say corner as my that. But yeah, you talk about this safety group that is incredible. I mean, JL Skinner, Tyreek Jones. When JL Skinner, I think, started maybe taking some of the heat off of his hits later in the season with some of those targeting calls, Tyreek Jones stepped up and was having highlight reel tackles as well. So there was never – I like what Andy Avalos is doing with this defense, where it's not built around one guy. It's built around a group of guys. You're talking about with defenses, you want star athletes, of course, but what you want bigger than anything else is team defense, where everybody else knows that the guy next to them has his section covered, and you can just go out and focus on doing your job and covering your side of the field and doing what you need to do. And I think Andy Avalos with the defense, we saw a little bit, I think under Harsin, we saw a little bit more of that star defense was built around one guy kind of guy, whereas with this defense, I think we bring back more of a team focus. And of course, the media is always going to focus on one guy every game that has that big game, but you could focus on anybody and write a good article on anybody on this team, because they all bring that nose to the ball, going to hit you and as hard as you can and put you in the dirt kind of style of defense, which I love from this unit. So I'm incredibly excited. I love the turnovers that we return, the guys that brought those turnovers, the turnover potential that we return on this unit. Like you said, across the board with those defenders, I'm excited to see what Kaniho can kind of do this season, a little bit more experience underneath him. He actually had more tackles than his brother last season. The more experience, he came in with a lot of potential and was able to build up to that. So I loved, and the times we were both on the field, it was great calling out Kaniho, they assisting on the tackles. So I'm excited to see what can happen from the secondary unit. I think that the turnovers showed their skills, that raw potential, and now coming into year 2, developing a little bit more awareness within Spencer Daniels' system. I think we're going to see more consistency overall in that secondary unit for coverage wise.
One position we haven't talked about on the defense yet is nickel. Kakala Kaniho is a tough guy to replace, maybe the toughest guy to replace on this defense. A 5-year starter, just a tenacious guy, undersized, but played tougher than he was great against the run, was great in man-to-man coverage. I'm curious to see about his possibilities in the next level. Obviously, he's not a draft pick. He's too small to get drafted, but I wouldn't be shocked to see him in somebody's camp next fall in the preseason trying to make a roster. I really wouldn't. And so in terms of who replaces him at that nickel role this year, my top 2 candidates are Rodney Robinson and Shea Oladipo. Rodney Robinson.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I had him down here to mention. I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that. I'm glad you brought him up.
Great athlete. Going to be really, really good for them. Rodney Robinson is a guy who's really cut out of the same mold as Kakala Kaniho. He's undersized, but he's athletic. He's smart. He's tough. We saw him start for Kaniho last year when Kaniho missed the first half of the UTEP game because of the targeting.
Yeah, that's right.
So he started that game. So I think he can start that role. Oladipo is interesting in that role because he's a bigger guy. He can really play against the run. If he comes out and shows the type of physicality to really stop the run, he might steal that job. So my top 2 are Rodney Robinson, Shea Oladipo, and a distant third is Roman Consensus, a guy who's banged up right now, but he's been on the roster for 3-4 years. Yeah, the coaches really like him. Is he a starter? I don't know, but he could be a quality backup.
And, you talk about Oladipo, a guy only 9 tackles last season, but 2 picks. So he's got, coming in, able to use that size against the run, but also a nose for the ball and able to grab those down as well. So
great instincts.
Great defensive overview there. Real quick, obviously video running a little longer than we intended, but that's great. I love the conversation. That's what it's all about. Getting hyped for this team, that is second team under a new coaching staff, coming into the second season. I think there's a lot of potential for them. We'll talk about that here at the end of this video. But let's talk about the special teams here real quick. I'm excited to see what we can see, what our perspectives on this, because you got right now one of the best kickers in the country. I mean, he is really not necessarily getting the attention that he deserves, but Jonah Dalmas, a former walk-on that we lucked into. I mean, what a guy. His first season, 7 out of 8 kicking, long of 51. Last season, 26 out of 28. Cannot ice this guy. I mean, coaches have tried. I mean, was the Fresno State coach, right? He tried to ice him 3 times there at the end of the first half and wasn't able to do it. The Iceman, Jonah Dalmas, long of 47. Could this be the year that he goes perfect from the kicking? Do you think perfect from the kicking strike?
Very possible. I mean, you talk about Jonah Dalmas. What an amazing story. He's a local high school kid. Really wasn't even a football guy in high school. He was a soccer star. He went on a Mormon mission after high school. Came back to Boise with no scholarship offer. Wasn't recruited. Went to the coaches. Talked them into giving him a 10-day tryout, which I thought was only a basketball thing. Makes the roster. Earns a scholarship his first year. And then last year he sets the program record for most made field goals in a season, breaking Tyler Ross's record. So the sky's the limit for this kid, man. I mean, I don't know what else to say about how a kicker gets better, other than maybe he can get a little more distance. You mentioned he had a 51-yarder his first year, 47 last year. Maybe he can get a little more distance, but I can't say anything bad about the kid. He's going to be great. You said it, he's hard to ice. He's got a strong leg. I think he's going to have a great season.
Boise State they've had those ups and downs in the kicking position. I mean, obviously last season, the year before that with Dalmas, and then Sachs was great before him. And then you've got some great names in that Boise State kicking history, but you also have a lot of Boise State games, and I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to cause any PTSD, but you have a lot of Boise State games that are lost in the kicking game. And so it is, and I as a Boise State fan, I cannot describe the amount of relief it is to be able to have Dalmas on the field and know 99% plus of the time, you're going to get that field goal no matter where he's lining up for that kick. A position with question marks, though, because we've lost Velasquez now, is the punting game. You've already talked about it a little bit when we were talking about incoming players. Dalmas has some punting experience. He punted in 2020. Gavin Whale had some punting experience from 2020 as well. So Dalmas punted 5 times. He's capable. Wiles punted 7 times, averaged 39.4 yards. And then we have the incoming Aussie. We've kind of already talked about our favorite being on that Aussie there. But what are your perspectives for this unit as a whole? Do you think that there's any chance Dalmas or Whale get a chance at that punting position, or do you think it's going to be on the incoming freshman?
I think it's going to be on the freshman. I to be perfectly honest, I haven't seen Gavin Whale punt very much, so I can't speak to that very, very well. But everyone loves that Aussie punter style. It gives you so many options to limit return men by pinning a guy in a corner. It also gives you so many options in the fake game because those punters are rolling out. If nobody rolls with him, what's going to stop him from running for 5 yards to pick up a first down?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it's James Ferguson's job to lose. Gavin Whale could certainly, surprise us, but I'd be shocked. Another name to keep an eye on in the kicking game, Will Farron is a freshman coming in this year. He's got a really strong leg. I think he could take on that kickoff specialist role right away out of the blocks. So I'll keep an eye on that as well.
Well, and we saw, I don't think it was last season, but 2020, they used Dalmas for their routine kicks, and then they brought Velasquez in for those really long, 52 plus, 50 plus yard kicks. So maybe we could see him in that position role, kind of coming in as that, Hail Mary kick, when you're going for those longer kicks potentially. Though Dalmas does have the leg, and I think you always want to go with your most consistent, but that's a potential role that we could see out there for him. Yeah, I like Will. I like the energy that he brings. Again, 2020, he did kick 7 times, but he's not his brother. He's not Sean Will. Not necessarily the same leg that he brings to the field. Not that he can't contribute. There's not necessarily a role that he could chip out in this defense, but the special teams unit. But the Aussie kicker coming in with so much upside, I think it's going to be hard to knock out. Then again, you could have games where the other team is keyed in on that rollout and they are sending the outside, and maybe you want to have a backup guy who can come in with a more traditional style kick and get it off the field if that other team is keyed in on how to stop you. So it's not necessarily, you're out of the race if you lose on this first string position. But I think we're both kind of on the same page here, looking at the Aussie as that number one guy to come in. Return man is a little bit of a question mark. Cobb's taking the kick return duties last year, but Khalil Shakir taking the punt return duties. And Cobb's only having 1 return, which was a good one, 81 yards and a touchdown. So he can obviously handle it. Do you think Cobb's takes on both roles this season?
I do. If I had to say right now, your top 2 return men are going to be Cobbs and Caples, with guys like Caden Dudley and Austin Bolt kind of waiting in the wings there. Caden Dudley's one to watch. I think he could get some returns this year. Caples is for sure going to get some returns. I wouldn't be surprised if Caples is the starting punt returner on day one. And then when you do kickoff return, you've got Cobbs back there. You got maybe Dudley back there. But Cobbs and Caples is going to be their show this year, with Dudley being that sleeper option. Another guy, and I apologize if I'm getting ahead of myself here, but another position they got replaced on special teams this year is that long snapper. Daniel Cantrell's gone. Cantrell was a 4-year snapper. I think Mason Hutton is going to take that job. He's a redshirt freshman, came in last year. Really big kid for a snapper. He's like 6'6", 215. And Daniel Cantrell told me that he is just on point with his snaps. Cantrell thinks he's going to take the job right away, this year. So that's going to be a big one as well.
Do you think there's an issue when you have, Boise State's done it in the past, but do you think there's an issue when you have your number 1, number 2 receiving option in a unit that we've already talked about doesn't necessarily have that explosive depth throughout? Do you think there's an issue when you have those first 2 guys being put into the most dangerous position on the field, snap after snap in that kick return game? Do you think there is any issue with that?
That's something that I plan to ask special teams coordinator Keith Bonifay about this week, because that's really a coach by coach thing. When Stacey Collins was here, he told me all the time he wanted his best guys on special teams. He wanted those playmakers to touch the ball as much as possible, even though it risked them getting injured. Keith Bonifay, maybe he doesn't feel the same way. I haven't asked him that question yet. I think last year with a guy like Khalil Shakir, it's just tough to take him off the field. Yeah. And you also and you also saw, and I can't say that the coaches told him to do this, but you also saw Khalil Shakir protect himself last year. He called for a lot of fair catches. Some that he probably shouldn't have fair caught. But so some of it's on the player to protect themselves when you're that number 1 guy. But really, getting those stars on special teams is all about coaching. Stacey Collins loved it. Maybe Keith Bonifay doesn't. I'm not sure yet.
And I know Boise State, that's always been, carry the hammer has been about that special teams. I mean, even you talk about those 2009, 2010 teams, watching interviews with the coaches, they said that they make special, a lot of teams make special teams kind of your new guy and or your, it's a chore to be on special teams. But for Boise State, they make it, or they have in the past, they've made that a pride thing. You earn your way onto special teams. You want to be out there. You have your first string defenders wanting to be out on special teams. And that's kind of the Boise State way. So it'll be interesting to see if that coaching staff continues that coming into this season as well. So, yeah, I didn't have anything else to add there on the special teams because you already covered the long snapper position as well there. Did you have anything you wanted to add on this unit before we kind of talk about some season expectations real quick here at the end of the video?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
All right. Cool. So again, running a little bit long on here, but that's okay because I could talk about Boise State football all day, and I know you're in the same beat there. So season projections here, again, don't hold us to these. We haven't gone in yet and done our in-depth analysis looking at every single team that Boise State's going to face and what the season's going to look like. But this is just kind of our feel coming into this spring practice, coming into what Boise State did last season, what we've kind of seen in the offseason trend there. So for Boise State, let's talk about it. Record 7-5 last season, coming into a little bit of an easier season this year. Definitely, I mean, you're not playing Oklahoma State. You've got a good home schedule as well. Your Power 5 team you're playing is Oregon State. So for Boise State, what are you kind of seeing? You can give a range. You don't have to be held to an exact number here, but what's kind of the range that you think Boise State might get to in their record this year? Realistic projection.
Sure. I think they get back to that 10-12 win season mark. They have a very favorable schedule. You touched on it. Oregon State, UT Martin, UTEP, and BYU are their non-con games. I mean, BYU is the only realistic team that they should lose to there. They should at least go 3-1 in those non-con games. They're going to be solid in conference this year. They have a tough stretch in the middle of the season. I believe they have Fresno State, San Diego State, Air Force, and BYU in a pretty close proximity there. So that's going to be a tough stretch. But I see them with what they've brought, what they're bringing back, what they've added to this team in terms of players and coaches. I'd be shocked if they don't win at least 10 games and get back to the Mountain West Championship this year.
And I agree, Mountain West Championship, absolutely something that is on the line and within reach for this team. I am being a little more cautious this season than I was last season. I like what this coaching staff is doing. I think that Andy Avalos and what he's brought to the table is the guy to get Boise State back to those 2009, 2010, 2011 era where we were in the top 10 on a routine basis. I think that he is the guy to get us there. And Spencer Daniels and Tim Plow as part of that coaching staff. I think this is the team to get us to that level. But I think that it's going to take a couple of recruiting cycles. I think a couple of years to get the team to fully buy into what they're trying to bring to the table here. I think that the third season for these coaches is what we're going to really see their true potential shine. I think the third season when you really see a coach for who they truly are. So I think that next season is going to be good. I'm excited for it. And when I start examining these other teams, I might raise my expectations here. And I probably will. The closer I get to the season, the more positive I get. And I end up saying, yeah, we're going to go 12-0 and blow everyone up by 50 points. But right now at this point, I think that 10 wins is a nice realistic projection. You look at that stretch you've mentioned: San Diego State, Fresno State, Air Force, Colorado State, who's going to be a lot better this year because they're basically Nevada now. Colorado State, and then BYU, and then Nevada. So that is the stretch right there. So you have rivals, you have improving teams, you have good teams that are returning a lot of level. That is going to be that's probably one of the hardest stretches of any group of 5 team in the country right there, having to play those teams back to back. So I don't know if Boise State's able to get through that. I don't think they're going to be able to get through that perfectly clean right now. And I think that there's a potential here with some injuries maybe mounting or some things to snowball where they lose those 2 games, maybe even 3 games there. But I would be happy right now with a 9-win season. I think that's a good step forward and puts us in a nice platform to springboard into that third year on these coaches. I'm excited for this season. We're going to go all the way. We're going to go to the playoffs. That's the fan side of me. When I'm looking at the analyst side, I'm a little more tempered right now in the expectations because I want this team to have the time they need to develop, because the issues that Boise State has been dealing with, they've not been a bad team, but they haven't been that team that everyone's talking about, that sky level team, that team that is going and playing in the playoffs like Cincinnati or threatening the playoffs like Cincinnati and UCF have, or even Coastal Carolina. They haven't been necessarily doing that. They've been 10-win seasons, but they've plateaued a little bit in what they're able to do. So I think that to get them back into that elite phase is going to take a couple of years of development and building within this unit before they're able to get back out to where Boise State fans expect them to be. So I'm a little bit more tempered. 12 wins Hey, I'm totally bought in on that. But right now, at least on my initial projections here, I think a 9 to 10 win season would be a good one for this team. What do you see as far as what fans might expect to see change ups to potentially the offensive style? Do you see anything that we might see different than we did last season, or even the defensive style overall? Expectations that fans can have for this season.
I think we'll see a little bit of smarter play calling. Last year there was a lot of first down runs that went nowhere that put the Broncos behind the chains a lot. I think we'll see that clean up a little bit. The focus here in spring ball is really on the red zone. Tim Plow was not happy with his red zone offense last year. They want to improve that. That they're going to improve that. We're going to see Scott Matlock on blocking on the offensive line again quite a bit in the red zone, just like we did last year. Schematically, I don't know that we see much changes. Andy was pretty vague about that the other day. He did say that he and Tim Plow sat down in the offseason and they took some stuff out. They added some stuff to the playbook. So we will see some differences. I think we see a few more trick plays than we saw last year. We talked about potentially a Riley Smith pass. I think they get back to that a little bit this year. I think it really just depends on offensively. It depends on that running game. If Helani's healthy, if Jinty's as good as we think he is, that's going to open so many doors. Especially in an RPO-driven offense. When you've got a running back that's getting 4 or 5 yards a pop, that the defense is just at a loss. They've got to key on that guy. And as soon as they key on that guy, the passing lanes are going to open. So I think the offense takes a big step forward. I don't know that we see a ton of difference. I think if Helani's healthy, we see a lot more running the ball. We see him getting 20 touches a game. If Helani's not healthy, we see the same thing we saw last year. It's going to be a lot of passing. It's going to be a mix and mash of everything. But I'm really bullish on this offense so far.
Well, that's awesome. And we're going to talk real quick here about this spring game that's going to be coming up. What can Boise State fans expect to potentially see out of this spring game? A lot of time coaches try to keep things close to the chest there. They don't want to reveal too much tape for opposing teams. But what can fans expect out of this spring game and potentially look forward to as we approach into the end of, we're just at the beginning now, but as we get in towards the end of spring training?
Yeah, you're going to see a very, very vanilla playbook. You're not going to see any trick plays. But what you're going to see is a lot of these young guys that we've just been talking about. You're going to see a lot of Ashton Jeanty in the spring game. You're going to see a lot of Taylon Green. You're going to see a lot of those young receivers. You're going to see, you might only see Scott Matlock for 2 plays in the spring game because they know what he can do. You're going to see a lot of Herbert Gums and Ahmed Hassanin and Cortez Hogans. You're going to see these young guys playing. And so I think that's going to really build some excitement. And, for the spring game, the spring is all about building that depth and creating the competition. We're going to see a lot of those guys that we've been talking about, seeing snaps. Just last year, we saw Kaniho Jr. and Isaiah Bradford see the most snaps at cornerback in the spring game. So that's what the spring game is all about. Breaking in these young guys, getting in some game experience, and seeing how they react when live bullets start flying.
Any chance at all for the fans like myself that happen to not get the opportunity to live in Boise? Any chance that you think it might be televised in some form for fans to watch?
I doubt it'll be televised, but it is free admission. So anyone around that wants to come should definitely show up. I'd be shocked if it's televised.
And I've been to a lot of spring games. It is an incredible atmosphere. Boise State fans, let's start this season out the right way. I think that there is a lot of excitement for this team, but there was some attendance issues last year. But I want Boise State fans to be excited about this program. I want Boise State fans to be out fully supporting this team like they should be. And the more that we support, the more that we give to this team, the higher their upside. Teams feed off of the fans in the stand. You are a 12th man out here making an impact. So let's start that energy right this way in the spring game. Bronco Nation, it's going to be a long break between the end of spring football and real football starting back up again. So drink it all in, take whatever you can, get to see a lot of exciting players and a lot of potential that might be coming out of this year. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for coming on the channel here and the great in-depth discussion. I don't mind at all that we ran long. I love the videos that we get to just, if it runs long, it means that we ended up having a more in-depth conversation than I even expected. So thank you so much for coming on the channel and sharing your insight. Again, everyone, Ron Counts, a writer for the Idaho Statesman. He writes tons of articles. I see you posting stuff all the time. Then, of course, during the season, you're going to see your keys to the game. And you also do the post-game analysis as well on that, is right? Yep. So a very, very incredible writer who's able to bring his perspective to the table. Thank you so much for coming on the channel here. Everyone, like I said, this is not the last video. Ron is going to be coming back on with BJ Rains to preview Khalil Shakir's draft potential. So he's definitely building some hype. I'm excited for that video. That's going to be coming out later this month. And then, like I said, the people I talked about at the beginning of the video will be getting, hopefully, we'll get Brian Dinwiddie, Dwight James, Derek Truman, and Tal Rasa, if not more players as well, onto the channel to talk about this exciting team and what they might be able to bring to the table coming into year 2022 and the second season under this coaching staff. So thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure you like and subscribe as always. Make sure you hit up Ron on Twitter, Ron at _ Bronco Beats and Bronco Blameyer on Twitter as well. Make sure you join Bronco Nation Updates on Facebook, over 8,000 members and growing every day. So thank you so much for watching. And as always, go big, boom.